Good Tuesday evening, everybody. Rob O'Connor here from RobVenoSports.com, ready for our Week 9 early look and our Week 8 recap of everything that's going on in the world of college football. To do all of that, I need to bring in the founder of RobVenoSports.com, Rob Veno himself. Rob, how are you this evening?
I'm doing great, Rob. How about you?
Doing great. We've got a lot to talk about. We saw a monumental upset in Happy Valley on Saturday night that really could end up impacting the college football race to the playoffs. So we'll start with that. I don't really think going into last weekend, either of us thought Penn State had any kind of real chance to win that game outright, but they ended up doing it. What did they do, and what did expose in Ohio State? And what's Ohio State's path to the playoff look like now, Rob?
Yeah, it's funny, right? Because everything that Penn State did in that game, they did in the fourth quarter. They outscore Ohio State 17-0 fourth quarter, come back from what, after three looked like a game totally in control of Ohio State, 21-7. But Penn State comes back with a huge fourth quarter, gets themselves a win, went back against the wall. Ohio State couldn't move the football. I think, the problems of the last 2 weeks, Rob, have become pretty well documented. The offensive line is having their troubles for Ohio State all of a sudden, and the offense just isn't moving the football the way it did to start the year. A lot of that, I think, certainly is schedule is done by the schedule, because the non-conference schedule, remember, for Ohio State, boy, they were loaded with teams that could not play defense, the Ohio State team. They played Tulsa. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head the first three non-conference games. But
they played Oklahoma, who they really destroyed the word defense with their game against Texas Tech last weekend.
They certainly did, and that was their third game. I think the opener was Bowling Green, wasn't it? It was Bowling Green, Tulsa, Oklahoma, all three teams that have shown no ability to play defense. So maybe, Ohio State's offensive results early on in the season were a bit misleading. Certainly since they've gotten into conference play, they have not been able to ring up the kind of numbers that they were putting up back then. So I think Ohio State has something to look at as far as offensive production is concerned. Let's not forget, though, that, last year they went through these same struggles offensively, and it wasn't until, I think, like the 11th game of the year, they had lost to Michigan State in the game where Ezekiel Elliott complained in the locker room afterwards for not getting the ball enough. And then Ohio State came out, and their last two or three games, their offense was virtually unstoppable. So they certainly can correct things. They've got a young team, an awful lot of talent. But for Penn State, it's a huge win, Rob. Let's face it. This team, led by James Franklin, really becoming forgotten in the Big Ten, and they sort of kept their name alive a little bit in the chase there. So big win for Penn State. We talked a little bit last week about their so-called offensive shift to more of a zone read team with Trace McSorley at quarterback. And right now they look to be playing as good as they played in the past couple of years. So we'll see if it carries on for Penn State. Before Ohio State, they need to do some things offensively, work out some bugs, especially across the offensive line.
Absolutely. And I think the biggest issue was that Penn State really forced Ohio State to really play a traditional offense. They didn't let the quarterback run wild against their defense. And I think that it kind of took Ohio State out of their comfort zone a little bit. And, Penn State definitely showed a big edge in special teams with the blocked punt and then obviously the blocked field goal returned for the game-winning touchdown.
Yeah, it's interesting with Penn State, Rob, because you can't forget the fact that they've lost a whole set of starting linebackers, and they're playing kids that really they didn't expect to be playing right now, and still they were able in that front seven to physically pretty much go toe-to-toe with Ohio State. So it's a good sign for Penn State, and like we said earlier, probably a little bit of a warning signal for Ohio State to straighten out some issues across that offensive front.
Absolutely. I guess we saw Ohio State go down. We saw the number one team in the country, Alabama, do it again. Third quarter, they are trailing 14-13. Next thing you look up, and it's 26-14, and then 33-14, just like that. We had talked about Texas A&M would have trouble closing out a game against Alabama, and we were absolutely right about that. They got the lead into the second half and then couldn't really do anything else with it. Alabama just too much for them, wearing them down the stretch. What does it say about Alabama, number one team in the country, favored by 18 or 19 points at home against the number 6 team in the country? Odds makers obviously knew what they were talking about, and that one is to hit right on the number of 19. If they're that much better than the number 16 in the country, what's somebody going to have to do to beat them this season?
Yeah, well, you have to play your best game, and certainly you have to be able to dent them, their defense, more often than Texas A&M did, right? I mean, if you really break down the statistical stuff in that game, you find out that Texas A&M offense gained 155 total yards on the 2 scoring drives and only 123 yards for the remainder of the game. So they were good for 2 drives, and basically that's it. They made those 2 drives stand up until, like you say, mid to late third quarter when Alabama got a defensive touchdown and started to make some big plays and opened it up, and A&M could never come back. But really the game dominated once again by the Alabama defense. It's funny, in handicapping and in betting, normally if you're going to lay 18 points with a favorite, you expect to need them to have to score, 38, 40 plus in order to cover a game. And with Alabama, because their defense is so good, you can cover 18 by scoring low 30s like they did, 33 points here. So it's a team that had an 11-minute and 40-second advantage in time of possession, and they ran the football. And Alabama just ran the football. 57 of the 82 plays were rushing plays in that game. Just, flexing their muscles and showing their dominance in the trenches once again. Very good defensive team, and the best in the nation right now. I don't think there's an argument there. I know that perhaps Michigan would say, what about us? Perhaps LSU would say, what about us? But I think from what we've seen so far, Alabama has taken on a lot of good offenses and basically done the job. So the West is kind of crowded right now, Rob, as much as we're heaping praise on Alabama. LSU and Auburn are still on the schedule, so it's not a done deal yet for the Tide, but that was a big win, a Western Division win in the SEC over Texas A&M. And Trevor Knight, the quarterback for Texas A&M, and I think they had higher hopes for what he could do for that offense, but he really didn't do much in that game last Saturday.
And I think both of us would see a path for Ohio State to get back into the playoff. It would involve beating Michigan, winning a Big Ten championship, and then getting into the Final Four. I'm not quite sure I see a path to the playoff for a one-loss Texas A&M if they get left out of the SEC title game in favor of, let's say, either an undefeated or a one-loss Alabama. Would you tend to agree with that Texas A&M is really going to need a lot to go their way and get to the conference title game to have a shot at the playoff, or do you think they could get in as a one-loss SEC West team with their only loss being in Alabama and not playing in their title game?
Yeah, and that would only, it's not knowing the tiebreaker system off the top of my head in the SEC West, but I guess you could say it's possible that if LSU beats Alabama, that Texas A&M, LSU, although I think Texas A&M probably still has to play LSU.
They do.
So that would make a 2-loss team there. So really, it's kind of tough to see it unless Alabama were to lose twice. I think right now the teams with the best shot in the West are the teams that still have only one loss and have Alabama on their schedule. And those two teams are Auburn and LSU. They're probably the teams with the best chance or the clearest, not a clear path, obviously, when you have to go through Bama, but the best path to get to a Western Division title, an SEC championship game, and then a Final Four bid into the college football playoff. I would have to think it's Auburn and LSU right now, and that loss hurt Texas A&M pretty good.
I would tend to agree with that. We would not be doing our due diligence for our listeners if we did not mention the coaching change at Fresno State, off to a 1-7 start, and that was enough to send their head coach packing. Rob, any impact? I mean, not that a lot of people are going to be looking to bet or get down on a 1-7 Fresno team as they play out the string here, but what impact does that have on things?
Well, I think the time it had come for Tim DeRuyter, and it's funny because when Fresno hired him, he was a hot name in college football, and they got the prize at that time, and the prize turns out to be not that big of a prize after all. So he's gone. Eric Casso is going to take over their offensive coordinator. He'll interim the rest of the way out, and we'll see what Fresno does for a head coaching situation. You know, as bad as that sounds, Rob, firing your head coach at this point in the season, if Fresno State has come up with 3 consecutive point spread covers, they're not winning games, but they're covering games. If you go even deeper, they've covered 4 of the last 5, even though they've lost 5 in a row. So in regular terms, straight-up terms, Fresno State's a disaster. In betting terms, if you're backing Fresno State, cashing tickets in 4 of the last 5 games is far from a disaster. It's a windfall, jackpot, so to speak. So they haven't given up on the season, obvious by those ATS numbers, and right now it's a team that odds makers undervalue, also obvious by those numbers. As long as they keep continuing to cover spreads while losing games, just means that there's value to the Fresno State side. Teams tend to play hard for an interim head coach, and the thing that you always like to look for immediately, and I haven't seen anything yet, Rob, and this is what you dig for, though, happened with Ed Orgeron at LSU, but you like to dig for anything that the interim head coach, might try to do differently than what's been done so far this season, because obviously he's on a stage now to possibly get the head coaching job at Fresno State, but also auditioning for other jobs across the country if the entire staff gets whacked at the end of the year. So sometimes coaches will go to different formulas. We saw, like I say, Ed Orgeron spread out the offense, throws it around a little more. They become more explosive. So far, I haven't seen anything that Casso might do with this Fresno State football team. But like I said, covering 4 of their last 5, they certainly do provide some value at this point in time.
Absolutely, and it's not that they're playing in a tremendous conference either against tremendous talent. So if the odds makers get too carried away with the lines, as you've seen, there'll definitely be some value in those games. Well, Rob, we're going to give you something a little bit out of the normal routine this week. We're going to start with our make or break game of the week because it's one of 5 games on a heavy Thursday night slate this week. And the game I'm referring to is a ACC divisional battle between Virginia Tech and Pitt, and the loser is going to be in a whole lot of trouble and most likely out of the conference championship picture. What do you see in this game? I know you mentioned to me earlier there's been a big move down in the total. How do you see this one playing out on Thursday night?
Yeah, why don't we start with that, Rob? Let's just go through the point spread on this game, the total. It's a Thursday night game, obviously, like you mentioned, one of 5 that will be played on Thursday night. This one obviously will garner the most national attention until later on when Cal plays USC. But Virginia Tech opened on the road as a 3.5-point favorite with a total of 64. The game has moved to Virginia Tech now a 4.5-point favorite, so money backing the Hokies. And the total has gone down considerably, over a touchdown in most places now, from 64 down to 56.5. No weather reasons for that to be going down, just simply based on fundamentals and the situation here that the money likes the under in this contest. I guess that Bud Foster's defense can be recognized as one of the reasons. Virginia Tech playing some stellar defense at this point in time. Held Miami of Florida to 16 points last week. They bounced back big from that loss to Syracuse, which really, Virginia Tech may end up kicking themselves for that loss, because they had already put themselves in a prime position the week before when they beat North Carolina on that Hurricane Matthew-soaked field in Chapel Hill. They beat North Carolina real well, got themselves to the top of the Coastal Division, then come right back and get hammered by Syracuse. Needed that win last week. They certainly got it. Everybody who saw it on national television saw how dominant they can be, not only defensively, but right now with Jared Evans really starting to feel comfortable in that offense. They've got some talent, and they've got some explosiveness to them in Justin Fuente's system. So I like Virginia Tech from all aspects at this point in time. The Pittsburgh side, we know that defense has been the biggest problem for the Pitt Panthers all season long. So if you're just looking at the fundamentals of this game and you look at the two defenses, there's a canyon's worth of difference between a Virginia Tech defense and a Pitt defense right now. Pitt has given up a lot of points and a lot of yards to almost every single team they've played. Virginia scored 31 on them, Georgia Tech 34. Marshall, who hasn't done a thing all year, was up 27. We know UNC got 37 in their game. If you go back to the Oklahoma State game, 45, Penn State 39. Everybody scored on this team. So I would expect, even though they're home and it's a big game, sometimes you can't fix personnel flaws, can't cover them up. So Virginia Tech should be able offensively to move on Pittsburgh. It'll come down to whether or not Pittsburgh can have success offensively against this Virginia Tech defense. I'll say one thing that I've noticed about the Pittsburgh offense, which has been very good. We don't want to take anything away from them. But when it comes to their passing game, Nate Peterman and company, they really don't push the ball down the field. Most of their stuff is very, very short to intermediate in the passing game. We know the aggressiveness of that Virginia Tech defense. They're likely to be, if not jumping routes, they'll be in press coverage and all over receivers. Pittsburgh's going to have to push the ball vertically down the field a little bit to get Virginia Tech to back off. Haven't made a play on this game yet either way, but like we said earlier, the early money here on this Tuesday has gone towards Virginia Tech and significant money on the under.
That would be clear by the line move, and we'll see what it does as it goes towards kickoff. Maybe it'll be a little bit of a buyback, as there's really a nice middle opportunity set up now that the line has dropped so much in the first couple days of betting on that game. Let's jump ahead to a big matchup in the Big 10. Well, it's the Big 12, but there's only 10 teams. West Virginia travels to Oklahoma State, and what's going to be a tough road test for the undefeated Mountaineers against Oklahoma State. West Virginia obviously still in the playoff conversation, haven't lost the game yet. They're clearly going to need to run the table to have a shot to get in. Not going to be an easy game. 4 Lions makers open them up as a small 3.5 or so point favorite at Oklahoma State. What do you see in this one, Rob? Does West Virginia keep their undefeated season alive, or is there a chance that Oklahoma State can do enough to get past them?
Well, right now, the talk surrounding West Virginia obviously is the talk about their defense, and the last 2 games in particular that they've played. TCU in that game last week had 13 possessions, Rob, and they were held scoreless on 11 of those 13 possessions. Really nobody does that to TCU. Now, there could be a flaw in the TCU offense because if you look to the week before, you'll see that TCU struggled offensively against Kansas. So it's been back-to-back games for the Horned Frogs where they have not scored. But I don't want to take anything away from what West Virginia did to them defensively last week. Like I say, to hold a TCU team scoreless on 11 of 13 possessions, that's pretty good. Those 11 scoreless drives, by the way, TCU only totaled 146 yards. So you're talking about drives that were short and sweet, either turn the ball over or give the ball back. Not much going on for Kenny Hill and TCU against this West Virginia defense, which the prior week had held Texas Tech to a season low in points and total yards. And we saw what Texas Tech did to Oklahoma and what Texas Tech does to just about everybody that they play on their schedule. So right now, a real light shining on that West Virginia defense. And it wasn't really figured to be the case to start the season. I mean, this is a defense that had some injuries. Dana Holgerson, the head coach, was praising the offense far more than the defense. And all of a sudden, it's completely turned around. Offensively, they didn't do much against TCU, but it was enough to win. Skylar Howard still very inconsistent as a thrower. Tough kid, but certainly not a consistent passer. On days when he really is feeling good in the pocket and throwing the football, he can light it up. But those days just don't happen every single week for West Virginia, so they have to rely on other ways to score points. Oklahoma State with Mason Rudolph, they can score on anybody. Defense has been their problem. I'm interested to see, Rob, more than anything, how this West Virginia team is going to react on the road to what figures to be mounting pressure to stay undefeated. Remember, Big 12 has no championship game, and while every other power conference is playing a championship game on championship Saturday, you know, the Big 12 is sitting home and watching, so they can't get in the eye of the College Football Playoff Committee. You got to do everything possible during the regular season to grab their attention. But I think it just, it adds pressure to every single game. And these Big 12 games, because the teams are so evenly matched, there's just none of them that are easy. It's basically a 6 or 7 game gauntlet running through all these squads. Like I said, I'd be interested to see how West Virginia handles it. I don't know that they will. I don't know that they won't. But I do think that Oklahoma State's going to do a little bit more offensively than what TCU did last week. I think TCU at this point in time is just way too banged up to be successful offensively, and they make way too many mistakes. Oklahoma State executes very well offensively. Even when they go dry for a period during a game, they seem to come back with a period where they just can't miss offensively. So I think it'll be a good game. And I think West Virginia, like I say, needs to have it between the ears when they go to Stillwater on Saturday and handle that crowd and handle that situation.
Well, Rob, I didn't have this one on the original list, but you mentioned that the Big 12 doesn't have a conference championship game. But wouldn't it be something if on final Saturday's college football season, an undefeated Baylor was playing an undefeated West Virginia? In order for that to happen, Baylor's going to need to get by Texas this weekend in a tough road game for them. It wasn't on the list, but real quick, some thoughts on that one as Baylor's about a 3-point favorite against Texas on Saturday afternoon.
Yeah, interesting football game, Rob. Like you say, you'd love to think that the schedule makers had it all figured out, but certainly it could just wind up being a stroke of luck that they match up Baylor and West Virginia in the regular season ender, which would certainly have the national attention focused on it. But like you say, in order to get to that, we have to get through all of these, and Texas and Charlie Strong every week is a struggle. We saw that last week against Kansas State. While the defenses played better, all of a sudden the offense could not score. This is a tough game for me to figure because Charlie Strong 2 weeks ago, prior to that game, decided that he was going to take over the defense. And since that point, the defense has looked better. But I don't know that they're going to be good enough to handle Baylor's offense. We see the total open at 70, pushed down to 69 right now. It's a high number, but Texas has exceeded that number quite a few times this year. I almost feel like this game is just going to be one of those Big 12 explosions where the team that has the ball last wins. Baylor won't fear going into Austin. Certainly Texas is going to play hard in this game. They'll be focused. So I think I'd probably look at the total before I looked at the game itself.
It will be a good one, and I agree. I think that it's all going to come down to if the Texas offense is clicking, and I think there's a chance they'll be able to click against that Baylor defense a little bit. But the question becomes is which Texas defense is going to show up to the game this weekend. And what's really a big game for Texas, who still has a little bit of work to do to get bowl eligible themselves. They like to get a win at home, as the Big 12 is, like you said, very evenly matched. So really need a home win to feel good about their chances of getting into a bowl game this year. Let's move to a game that means a heck of a whole lot for one team, and their biggest rivals going to try and play spoiler. Florida, Georgia, the world's largest outdoor cocktail party. I guess we're allowed to call it that on this show. I don't think we'll frown upon that terminology too much.
Mm-hmm.
But you've got a Florida team that's only got one loss in the East against a Georgia team that's got 3 losses in SEC play. And I think if you go back all the way towards the beginning of the season when Georgia barely beat Nicholls State 26-24, and you and I both kind of wrote that off as, they probably weren't playing their A game that day. They had better things to do than worry about Nicholls State. But then they've had some bad losses since then. Does this Georgia team have anything in them to get up for this huge rivalry game to really try and derail Florida's season?
Yeah, it's going to be tough. First things first, both of these teams had the extra week to prepare. So you've got 2 weeks for Florida to get ready here, 2 weeks for Georgia to get ready here. Shouldn't be any excuses. But Kirby Smart's team, Rob, the passing game, as erratic as it is, here's what we saw a couple of weeks ago when Missouri came into Florida. And Missouri, with the high-flying passing attack, met up with the Florida cornerback, and we know who won that matchup. And I just get the same feeling about this game here for Georgia. Now, the difference between Georgia and Missouri is Georgia can also turn around and hand off to Nick Chubb if they could get the ground game going. But if you're Florida and you can leave your 2 corners on an island against a freshman quarterback and a receiving core that Isaiah McKenzie, of course, we've heard it all season long, his nickname, the human joystick, and he's made some big catches. But they're not a great or an elite receiving core, so you probably can leave your corners man-to-man on an island and put 8 in the box and dare Georgia to throw here, and I just wonder if they can. I saw what happened to Drew Lock, and I'm pretty sure that's what's going to happen here to Georgia. And meanwhile, Florida has had the extra week to get a little bit more going out of their offense. Remember, Luke Del Rio came back at quarterback right before the break, so that's a good sign for Florida. They have shown some signs this year of being able to score points, throwing the ball a little bit better this year, running the ball pretty well. I just feel like Georgia is an overmatched football team in this game, and it's not that often that we say that Georgia is overmatched by Florida. But if you can't throw the football effectively, I wonder how much their offense can produce here. And you could take it a step further, Rob, and say that Florida's disruptive defense, if they can slow Chubb down, will probably force turnovers in this game and make life real difficult on the Georgia Bulldogs. The Florida-LSU game that you and I talked about a couple of weeks ago, will it be rescheduled, will it not? And we know that since then it's been rescheduled. But we talked about how important that game could be later on in the season. And I think Florida still, with their only loss in the East coming to Tennessee, if they can get Tennessee to falter somewhere along the line here, and if they can continue to win football games, Florida could stand in good shape in that division. So a lot to play for the Florida Gators. not so much for the Georgia Bulldogs outside of bowl eligibility. I feel like Florida's the better football team right now, and I just don't think that they're going to be able to throw the ball effectively enough to balance out their offense.
I would tend to agree. I don't think that Georgia's got it in them to play that 60 minutes of perfect football that they're going to need to play against a team that is substantially better than them. What did you have your line at for this game?
And, of course, you said it earlier, Rob, but let's make sure that all the listeners know that the game is played on a neutral field here. So when you make a point spread for this game, you take off for home field. The Jacksonville site has always been equidistant for both sides, so not that big of an advantage. But I came out with a number of -5.5 with my power ratings, and that's where the game opened. So I thought that the odds makers did a good job with this one. And the one thing I will say, Rob, as I go back here, thinking about the analysis I just gave, and I think I inferred that Tennessee in the East is in the driver's seat rather than Florida. The only reason they'd be in the driver's seat is because they've beaten them. But Florida actually has the better conference record right now. So Florida is in the driver's seat if they don't lose. So plenty for them to play for. They can't really slip up, because if they do fall into a tie with Tennessee, Tennessee would own a tiebreaker. But in this game in particular, I really just think that Jim McElwain's club is the better team. Kirby Smart, and I don't know what your impression has been of Kirby Smart as a first-year head coach so far. We know he was an outstanding defensive coordinator at Alabama. Say what you will about the talent that he gets, you still have to get the talent to play, and they played well for him. But I've seen, through 6 games so far, 6 or 7 games, whatever it's been for Georgia, I see a head coach that's struggling a little bit to get used to the head coaching role. And I don't think that Georgia, through the system changes that they went through this year on both sides of the football, has really gotten any traction yet. That's also a big plus for the Florida Gators.
I think that defensively Georgia's been okay, about what I expected them to be, but I think that they've been a lot worse offensively, even when they're getting up into the 20s. This is a team that could easily be scoring 35, 38, 41 points a game. They have the talent. They have a tremendous running back in Chubb, and I just feel that they're not clicking enough right now, and they're getting behind in these games, and then they can't run the ball, and they're just, to me, it seems they're a lot more out of sync on the offensive side of the ball than they are on the defensive side of the ball.
Yeah, if you look at them yards per play average in the nation right now, Georgia ranks 88th in FBS football. That's not a position that they're used to being in, and it does put pressure on the defense as well to come through and make extra stops. And when you were going through their schedule of disappointing losses so far, I'd have to say that now that we've seen 7 games of Missouri, the fact that Georgia had to beat Missouri on a 4th and 20 at the end of the game to win that game, it's not a real impressive win anymore. At the beginning of the season, maybe Missouri looked a little different than they do to us now. So I can't say that there's been anything overall that Georgia's done this season that really has wowed us in Kirby Smart's first year. But he's not going to be judged on 1 year. He's there for a minimum of 3, and I'm sure that recruiting and these systems will all kick in and Georgia will be back. But right now, to me, they're just in a transition phase.
Well, Rob, we need to shift gears and head out west. Huge matchup between Washington and Utah. Washington is undefeated on the season, 7-0, probably facing their toughest test prior to the Apple Cup game when they have to travel to Washington State. And they're playing a Utah team who might be a little undervalued, in my opinion, here. I mean, spread opening at about Utah getting 10 points at home against Washington. I mean, look at this Utah team. They haven't been overly impressive by any stretch of the imagination. But you have to remember, this is a Utah team that's about a yard and a half away from being undefeated. They get stopped on the goal line by Cal at the very end of that game and come up 5 points short of what would be a matchup between two Pac-12 undefeated teams this week. What do you think, Rob?
Well, I'll say this. Washington has been, and this is not going out on a limb, nothing anybody doesn't know, they've certainly been the most impressive team result-wise so far this season. Not only have they beaten people, but they've destroyed people. However, the people that they've destroyed, you can poke holes in every single one of them, right? Rutgers, no good. Idaho, no good. Portland State, FCS team. Arizona, so banged up that they're not any good. And Washington barely won that game, 35-28. Then they play Stanford, a team that is down this season. They've shown it 3 consecutive weeks now. And then Oregon, who has been an absolute mess defensively this season, and the offense has not been as good either. So, Washington still has a little something to prove. I know there's still skeptics out there. The eye test sometimes is the way to go. I don't use it all the time because I think that your eyes can get carried away with the most recent thing that you've seen. But the eye test would tell you that Washington is the better team here. Utah wins games in Utah fashion. They play you physical. They keep the game close. And then they try and steal it in the end against teams that are of equal or better talent. In this case, we'll see if they can keep it close. I'll say one thing here, Rob. The quarterback for Utah, Troy Williams, is a Washington Husky transfer. So if there's anybody with motivation here to succeed against the opponent, it's Troy Williams. He wants to get back at his ex-team. And Troy Williams is a talented kid who, when Utah was struggling to find a quarterback in the offseason, came through with a good enough performance during the starting job and hasn't looked back since. But it's a banged-up football team. Wow, you look at the injuries that they've had through the last month, and the fact that they've been able to, or the fact that they're able to be standing where they're standing right now is really amazing. They lost 2 centers. They've had 4 or 5 running backs on the injury list seemingly every week. Banged up wide receiving core, guys banged up on defense, and yet they still find ways to get the job done. And they've played better opposition for the most part than has the Washington Huskies, although power ratings would suggest, I'll just leave you with this number, power ratings say that Utah overall has played a schedule on average 4 points better per team than Washington has. So, strength of schedule is usually something that I'll look at. I don't know that it's going to play a big role here. We'll see how Troy Williams does against this defense. But I know that when Washington was asked to step up in a spotlight game against Stanford, they won that thing 44-6. So here they'll be asked to step up again. They're still skeptics. I wouldn't be surprised if they step up again. I just think Utah is a little bit outclassed in this matchup. I'm trying to get you the power rating number on this team as I search through my numbers here. And the power rating on this game would tell you that Washington is really overvalued by the odds makers. Power ratings say that Washington on the road should be a 5-point favorite, yet they're laying 10.5 on the road. So it shows you the love affair from the odds makers and their anticipation of where the bettors are going to go in this game by making the point spread that high. Still, I remember the same scenario when Washington played Stanford and Washington blew that team out. So we'll see. Washington's the better team. Maybe point spread-wise, you can make the argument that Utah at home you're getting a little value. But I don't know that value will hold up in this game. I'm looking at the Washington side. We'll see if I get to the window with it or not.
We've got a very big game in the Big Ten on Saturday night between Nebraska and Wisconsin. Nebraska comes in the undefeated, higher-ranked team. But as we know, records and rankings don't mean anything when Vegas is setting lines on this game. They've looked at what two-loss Wisconsin has done. They see that their only 2 losses are very close, hard-fought losses to both Ohio State and to Michigan, and they've instilled Wisconsin as about a 9-point favorite in this game. Wisconsin clearly the more tested team between them and the schedule Nebraska has played. Any chance Nebraska puts some magic on the road together and keeps an undefeated season alive, or is this Wisconsin team finally going to be the team that ends Nebraska's undefeated season?
Yeah, I'll tell you what. For those who watched last week, Purdue had Nebraska on the ropes for the better part of a half, maybe even into the third quarter a little bit before Nebraska really turned it on. I think Nebraska scored on 4 of their first 5 possessions of the second half to really put that game away. But again, you watch Tommy Armstrong play quarterback, Rob, and I almost called him Tommy Frazier there for a minute. If it were Tommy Frazier, I wouldn't have any doubts if we go back to 1995. But Tommy Armstrong, the current quarterback for Nebraska, he just makes too many mistakes, not necessarily in the turnover game, although he does turn the ball over, but in just missing open receivers. It's tough. It seems to be a grind for this Nebraska team. And against Purdue last week, they had trouble running the football. They could not, with their offensive line, push Purdue backwards in that football game. And that's a real concern when you're going to play Wisconsin, because we know Wisconsin defensively is as stout as they come. And if you're not going to be able to push Purdue backwards, going into Madison and asking this Nebraska offensive line to push Wisconsin backwards isn't really likely to happen. However, all that being said, Wisconsin has made the most of an injury situation all season long. They just got Vince Beagle, their top linebacker, back last week. He had been out for a few weeks. They had 2 linebackers hurt. As soon as they get Beagle back, their leading tackler, Jack Cicci, gets hurt for the season. Another linebacker down. So now that Beagle's back, they've lost their top tackler at linebacker. They've got 3 other linebackers on the injury list as questionable this week. Boy, oh boy, they keep marching guys out there. They keep shutting offenses down. But at some point, this has to take a little bit of a toll on Wisconsin's defensive unit. Can Nebraska exploit that? I'm not so sure. I'm really not. From what I saw last week, I would think that Wisconsin's going to have the upper hand defensively. They went to that 2-quarterback system last week. We saw Hornibrook play a couple series, come out. Bar Houston come in, play a couple series, come out. But the common denominator is they could hand the ball off to Corey Clement and watch him run. That Iowa game last week at Iowa City was a huge win for Wisconsin. And you and I had talked at the beginning of the season about how wicked the Wisconsin schedule was, especially the crossover games where they had to play Michigan, Ohio State. Michigan State hasn't turned out to be the team we thought they would be, but still they were on the schedule. And Wisconsin has survived all of that. Barely lost to Michigan, barely lost to Ohio State. It's a pretty good football team. I don't know that Nebraska has enough, Rob, in all honesty. I think this is probably the week where they fall. I think this is probably the week where Wisconsin's offense gets untracked a little bit. I think it's important that we take a look not only at that Nebraska running game, but also at the Nebraska passing game with Armstrong at the helm, and the fact that Jordan Westerkamp, their leading receiver, was out last week, but back this week. Could help a little bit. It always hurts a quarterback when he's without his top receiver. But still, I think Wisconsin's the better team. And that venue is just difficult for anybody. So we'll see, but I think Wisconsin's probably the right side.
I would tend to agree with that, and I think that when you look at the fact that Wisconsin has 2 losses and Nebraska's undefeated, yet they're getting that many points on the road, that right there should raise a red flag to even a casual sports gambler when he's just looking at, why is the undefeated team getting 9-10 points on the road? Like, something should be going off in everybody's mind when they see that line, we should really look into it a little bit more, you would think.
Yeah, because the two-loss team has had the misfortune of playing Ohio State and Michigan, and the undefeated team hasn't had to do any of that yet. So,
exactly.
Strength of schedule, a lot of times, will tell the tale for us. So that's why we look at it so heavily. By the time the end of the season comes, conference play, everybody's pretty much going through everybody, and it doesn't mean as much then. But like you say, right now, to the average person who follows an AP-style poll or ESPN, USA Today, coaches-type poll, you would have that question. How is the undefeated team getting that many points? But certainly we understand why when we look at what these teams have done and who they've done it against.
And then what's funny is when these sports highlight shows go on the air Saturday night at 11:30 at night, they'll call it an upset if Wisconsin wins.
Yeah, well, have to roll with the punches there. We know better, but that's exactly it. Like I said, if you take the top 25 of an odds maker's power ratings or even a handicapper's power ratings, mine, for instance, in that situation, and lay them out against a poll, a AP, like I said before, coaches, USA Today, any of those polls, they'd be dramatically different. They're very dramatically different. You could sometimes find 3-loss teams inside the top 25 of an odds maker or a handicapper's poll where you would never see that in the other style polls. So, we're just looking at different things. That's all. One side is looking at point spread covers and how a team has done against a difficult schedule, and the other is just looking at plain old wins and losses.
Absolutely. I think this final game we're going to talk about, I think you and I both had much higher expectations for this game at the beginning of the season. Clemson traveling down to Florida State. Clemson's held up their end of the bargain and comes in undefeated. Florida State, on the other hand, has not held up their end of the bargain. They come in with 2 losses. Any chance for Florida to at least spoil Clemson's perfect season, or has Florida State really shown some flaws in their 2 losses that Clemson's going to be able to exploit? And at least in my opinion, Clemson hasn't looked all that good quite a few times this season. If they're not at 150% ready mentally for this game, they're going to be in a world of trouble.
No, and that's the truth. And what we've seen so far early this week is we've seen nothing but support for Clemson. Clemson opened here 2.5-point favorites. They've since increased to, depending upon where you're shopping, because the offshores and the Las Vegas casinos have different numbers out there, but it could be anywhere from 4, 4.5, or 5. But the point being that Clemson has gotten all the money so far, and Florida State's the home team here. Total has been bet up from 58.5 to 60. I think that's logical, considering the way Florida State's defense has played all season long. You would expect people to react towards the over where the total is concerned. Interesting piece I read today where the head coach, Jimbo Fisher of Florida State, said that if defensive back Derwin James can go at all, then he's going to play in this game. I don't know that there'll be an effectiveness to him, but we do know, and I've said previously that 6 weeks ago when Derwin James got injured, I certainly underestimated that injury. I did not consider it to be as serious as what I found the head coach and the coaching staff thought it was 2-3 days later. And when they started talking about how devastating an injury it was, then we saw the performance on the field of the Florida State defense over the course of the last 5 games, and you understand the coaches knew, and you have to react accordingly and pretty quickly when you're betting these games. So Florida State, like I say, they could get James back. I just don't know how effective he'll be. They'd be rushing him back by about a week in this instance. It's going to take a lot to stop Clemson. Listen, Clemson's been their own worst enemy offensively all season long. Even in games where they didn't look or they didn't produce, let's put it that way, where they didn't produce the numbers that we expected the Deshaun Watson-led offense to produce, it's mainly because they've shot themselves in the foot, either stuff like Ray McLeod running a 75-yard punt back and dropping it on the half-yard line before he crosses the end zone, so they don't get 7 points, they get 0. Deshaun Watson in the beginning of the year making silly mistakes with the football. Against North Carolina State, up and down the field in the first half, getting to the NC State 4, 5, and 24 and coming away with nothing in 3 instances, turning the ball over all 3 times, made that NC State game look so much closer than it really had to be. Then we saw Louisville blow NC State out last week, right? So Clemson, if they play error-free or relatively error-free, let's put it that way. I don't want to put the whole burden on them to put zeros up where errors are concerned, but if they play relatively error-free, they're going to move the football up and down the field on Florida State. The question is, defensively, will they hold up against the Florida State offense? It's a real good offense. Clemson hasn't played many outstanding offenses this year. Louisville, there's some out there that think Louisville should have won that game against Clemson. So certainly Florida State has offensive capabilities. We know that. It could be problematic for the Clemson defense. I think we all found out today that Wayne Gallman is going to play a starting running back for Clemson, so that helps. But I think if you're looking at this contest and you want to find a way to play it, I think the bettors have it right by betting the over in this game, because at 60, when you break it down in half, you're looking for 30 a side, and you want to ask yourself if 30 per side is unreasonable. I don't think it is unreasonable in this game. The fact that the game's moved up from 2 over across 3 quickly, which shows you how much money was bet on Clemson, and now up to 4, maybe even 5. We'll take a better look at that. Power rating says Clemson should be a 2-point favorite in this game, not a 5-point favorite. So certainly there's some discrepancy there. But I think it's going to be high scoring, Rob. I think it'll be entertaining, and both sides will move the football without much trouble.
And I think that these line moves that we've seen on some of these games this week, something we haven't talked a whole lot about, but the importance of placing your bet at the right time. I mean, those guys that got in early, quickly, when it was 2, 2.5, definitely got the better number. It's not coming back down under 3 again, and I think that just goes to show you that while sometimes you got to wait and see what the weather's going to do, or if there's going to be a key injury that you're waiting for some clarification on, sometimes if there's a number out there that you really like and it's near a key number of like 3 or 7, sometimes it does pay to play early in the week and get out in front of a number if you think it's going to go in the opposite direction of what you're looking to bet.
Yeah, and it's certainly the cat and mouse game that's played between bettors and odds makers. Maybe someday we'll get into a real technical talk about how this works, Rob, in a podcast, but for now, we'll let the extreme technical stuff let it off to the side here. But I will say this. Line moves happen, and I'm not talking about regular-size line moves, normal line moves. Big line moves happen earlier and earlier in the week now. It never used to be that you would see games move so much so quickly, but there's almost like it's come down to really 2 waves of line movements throughout the week right now. Like, for instance, yesterday, totals went up on football games. Generally speaking, the totals didn't move 3, 4, 5, 7 points as we saw in one instance in the Virginia Tech-Pittsburgh game that we talked about. We wouldn't see those kind of moves until approximately Thursday afternoon, 3 o'clock Eastern time. A lot of big syndicate groups, a lot of highly respected sports advisory services release picks then, and then games go wild. But now we're seeing games go wild on Tuesday morning. And if you're not there, if you're not privy to have an offshore account, or if you're not in Las Vegas and you can't make your play off the opener, then you're pretty much SOL 24 hours later, because these games have gone And like you said earlier, for the most part, and this is where we get into the technical stuff that we won't harp on tonight, but for the most part, those games aren't coming back. You're not getting that second chance. So waiting until Saturday morning, there's a reason why, as a sports advisory service myself, that I release games on Thursday morning, Thursday afternoon, early afternoon to clients. And it's to get ahead of the line. Exactly as you laid it out is exactly why we do that stuff, because you want your clients to get the best of the number. Like I say, unless you're in the betting game, it's very tough to get in on the opener. So clients don't necessarily have that opportunity, but we try to make it as good as we can for them in anticipation of where line moves are headed by the time Saturday morning comes. Because once Saturday comes, anybody with a line service, you just sit there and watch your computer screen and watch numbers bounce around all over the place all morning long. It's crazy. And for the most part, you're in on the wrong end of things. So it's an interesting and exact science, and I probably stretched it out and got too long-winded in describing some of it. But like I say, there's a time and a place where maybe we'll have a podcast on Rob Veno Sports about exactly how some of these things work. And like I said earlier, the cat and mouse game that's played between big bettors and odds makers, and also the public bettors. You know, big bettors are out there for themselves, not necessarily for all bettors.
And Rob, I think the time and place would be the off season when we're not looking at openers and numbers and setting power lines and rankings a whole week long.
Yeah, and how about worrying about the NBA and the World Series tonight, right? It's just crazy how things overlap, and in 3 weeks we're going to have college basketball for real. So this probably isn't the right time to do it. You're absolutely right.
But I think I might have said the last game we talked about was the last game we were going to talk about. iLive, so if you're still listening, we got one more for you, and that is Auburn, still only a one-loss team in the SEC. They are going to be traveling to Ole Miss to face probably one of the better offenses that they're going to go up against this year. We saw them early in the year when they played the Clemson Tigers. They were able to hold Deshaun Watson in that offense in check. Do you think they'll be able to hold Chad Kelly and that offense in check in a tough road environment? Or do you think that Ole Miss might have a little too much firepower for Auburn?
Well, I think off of last week, let's start with last week's game where Ole Miss played LSU, right? And LSU comes out the winner. But what LSU did in that game, Rob, after about the third or fourth drive of the contest to the Mississippi offense was really impressive. And Mississippi didn't necessarily come close to scoring for the majority of the remainder of that game after they got ahead and looked like they were going to move the ball rather easily against LSU. LSU stiffened. Auburn's front seven is no joke. They can compete with any offense inside that SEC, and in particular in the SEC West. So Mississippi will have their work cut out for them. That being said, you know, Chad Kelly and those weapons, without a running game, this guy does it too, I might add, because they really do most of it through the air. They don't line up and run the football at you, but they can score on you. I just think it's interesting, the evolution of Auburn so far this season, from a forgotten team, from a team that, they stink 3 weeks ago, to a team where last week all of a sudden they're laying 10 against Arkansas, and not only laying 10, they're winning by 53. Gus Malzahn turned the play-calling duties over to offensive coordinator Rhett Lashley 3 weeks ago. We talked about it on our podcast last week, and ever since then the offense has taken off. The Auburn offense looks like what we expect Gus Malzahn's offense to look like right now, and it's going to be an immense amount of trouble for Ole Miss, who has already, for Mississippi, Rob, I think it probably feels like they've already played a 13-game schedule. You go back to the very first game where they went through the ringer against Florida State and came up short 45-34. Then they play Alabama 2 weeks later, 3-touchdown lead, wind up losing by 5. Then they have that crazy game against Arkansas where they get beat 34-30. Then last week they're right back at it with LSU. I mean, the opponents list, the opposition list for this team has been incredible all season long. Even their non-conference stuff hasn't been gimmies. And Memphis is one of the better teams in the AAC. And from the Eastern Division, they've played Georgia of the SEC. So they've not really had a break all season long. And they're not going to get one here. Auburn's a very good football team, still in the hunt in the SEC West. I think one thing you want to consider, and we've said this before about Mississippi, but now, really, at this point, where are they mentally? I mean, that's their third loss of the season, their fourth loss of the season last week against LSU. And at this point in time, you have to wonder if, this team is just like, let's mail it in, because everything's gone for them. I mean, they're looking at something like maybe a Liberty Bowl. I don't have the exact bowl affiliations for the SEC right in front of me, but they're looking at a minor bowl bid at this point in time, a team that thought they had a chance to go to the college football playoff. Disappointing at best. Still 5 teams to go in the season and some tough teams to play. Auburn catches them at a good time, and Auburn catches them when they're on fire right now. So it's interesting to me just to see how Auburn has really turned it on, the offense catching up with the defense, and they're a threat at this point in time to Alabama. Remember, when we look back to that Auburn-LSU game where LSU had the touchdown nullified at the very end of the game, replay overturned it because they got to play off too late, led to Les Miles firing. That win for Auburn in that game where they kicked 6 field goals could turn out to be a real difference maker in the SEC West. We'll see.
I was thinking the same thing, that one play redefined Auburn's season.
There's no doubt, right? I mean, and if it plays out well for them, right, and just for instance, if they were to go through the SEC and win their games and come up against Alabama and pull the upset, they win the division and go to the SEC championship game, and from there, potentially they could sit, depending upon how the committee sees things, but they could sit in the college football playoff as a 2-loss team, but an SEC champion. So all these scenarios that end up coming out of a college football season are usually not the ones that we project when the season starts, but this could be an interesting one. I like the way Auburn's going right now. Mississippi I just feel for, because it's a far better football team than what their record indicates right now. Some tough injuries, some tough losses. And we'll see if Hugh Freeze's team continues to play with some heart or if they, just let down at this point in time. I don't know if they'll do it in front of the home fans, but it's certainly a possibility.
Well, Rob, we talked about quite a few games, and I think that's because there are quite a few games that have a lot of stakes in them this weekend. One of the better college football weekends of the year to date, to say the least, with all these big games, and things are really going to start to shake out as we come down the stretch. Anything that we haven't talked about yet that you think our listeners need to be aware of heading into this weekend?
One thing that I did Monday afternoon, Rob, that is just something that I do at this time of year, but perhaps if anybody listening wants to go through the same process, is it's to that point of the season where teams are really checking into their bowl opportunities and chances. And what I like to do is take these teams that are, 3-4, 3-5, only 4 or 5 games left, but need 3 wins, and they're in what I would call a desperate situation at this point in time for wins. Most of these teams are going to show up on your rotation card as underdogs, and sometimes, a lot of times, are really worth playing because they're going to play with that extra bit of desperation, trying to make it to a 6-6 game. It's not a blanket statement. You have to check each team individually and sort of gauge for yourself, is this a team that I think is A, good enough, and B, desperate enough? But it's a process I go through. I came up with about 24 teams to look at this week, and we'll continue to do that for the remainder of the season, because to a lot of these schools, as we well know, boy, a bowl appearance is a huge, huge deal. I sort of diminish the fact that, Mississippi is going to go to a minor bowl bid. But a minor bowl bid to even some bottom-level Power 5 conference teams, like I said earlier, is a big deal. So if you want to go ahead and look at some of those, I think that's a process worth going through. Just kind of highlight all the teams that are at 3-4, 3-5 at this point in the season, and see what they're up against this week, and maybe you come up with a couple of plays.
Well, I think the one that I touched on earlier, Texas sitting at 3-4, and as we know, the Big 12 is tough, and this is one of their remaining home games of the season. They're probably looking to make some noise. I think Notre Dame at 2-5 is as desperate as they come. Could you imagine if that program does not make a bowl game? They got a tough one against Miami. We didn't talk about it because it's really irrelevant in the grand scheme of what matters most at this time of year. You got Indiana at home, 3-4, very winnable game for them against Maryland. I mean, those are just a few that stand out right off the bat with some pretty decent, respectable programs that are still looking to find their way into a game later this December.
Yeah, and teams that are used to being there, right? I mean, you could throw into the mix Michigan State, UCLA, Oregon, all teams that are used to being there that now have their backs up against the wall just to make a minor bowl bid, just to get to the 6-6 threshold. So, like I said, it's worth looking into. It's worth looking into everybody's individual situations. Some are different than others. But boy, oh boy, they're out there, and it's just something I like to go through this time of season.
Absolutely. Great thought and advice there, Rob. Well, that's going to do it for this week, our Week 9 early look. I'd like to thank everybody for listening. Before we go, just a reminder, get over to robvenosports.com. Great source of information, all kinds of statistics, easy to navigate, very easy to understand. Should be a weekly stop on your handicapping tour through the web. And, of course, plays are available for myself, Derek, and Rob Veno all weekend long, college and NFL. Get over to robvenosports.com and check it out. That will do it for this week. We'll be back again next week to recap what we saw in a very busy Week 9 of college football and look ahead to some of Week 10's biggest game, including the showdown between Alabama and LSU, both of whom are off preparing for their game this weekend. We will see you next week. Thanks for listening, everybody.